Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's important webinar on the 65th anniversary of the first French nuclear test in Algeria, which took place on February 13, 1960 in the Sahara Desert known as Gerboise Bleue. This was the beginning of a series of nuclear tests left devastating legacy on the people, environment, health, and that is a legacy that continues to this day. My name is Imène Hmili. I am the program manager at SHOAA for Human Rights, and I am delighted to be your moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I would like to thank each of our panelists for joining us today and for their invaluable work on this issue. We are joined by Dr. Becky Alexis-Martin, an academic expert specializing in geography and environmental health, Rachid Aouine, the founder and executive director of SHOAA for Human Rights, Charles Olchak-Johnson, the policy director at the International Physician for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Also, we have Richard Outram, Secretary at Mayors for Peace, UK Ireland chapter, and Sophie Chalma, a social design researcher. For our attendees, participants, please feel free to share your thoughts and questions throughout the chat feature, and we will address them during the Q&A session towards the end. I also would like to remind everyone that there is instant interpretation to English, French, and Arabic. So I think we're ready to begin the discussion. Rachid, the floor is yours.
تحية طيبة. فقط أريد أتأكد إذا كان فيه ترجمة فورية أم لا. تحية طيبة لكم جميعا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله، مساء الخير. طبعا نحن اليوم في الذكرى 65 لأول تجربة نووية فرنسية في الصحراء الجزائرية، والتي يطلق عليها اسم اليربوع الأزرق. طبعا في هذا اليوم، في هذه الذكرى لليوم المشؤوم الذي عرفته الصحراء الجزائرية، كانت أول تجربة نووية في الصحراء الجزائرية، تجربة نووية جوية، وتلتها 16 تجربة أخرى. اليوم في هذا اللقاء، في هذه الندوة، حتى نستذكر التجربة وفي نفس الوقت نتكلم عن الأضرار التي ما زالت مستمرة نتيجة هذا التفجير النووي، وتحديد المسؤوليات، والحديث عن ربما عملنا كمنظمات حقوقية أو منظمات مهتمة بمناهضة التجارب النووية في العالم. أين وصل ملف التجارب النووية الفرنسية في الجزائر، وكيف عملية المناصرة، وما هي ربما أين الإشكال بالضبط، وأين هو الملف ما زال عالقا، وكيف تعاملت معه السلطات الفرنسية والجزائرية، وكيف تتعامل مع هذا الملف، وتحديد المسؤوليات بشكل صريح وبكل شفافية. طبعا خلال مناصرتنا لهذا الملف، والذي يعتبر هو من بين التجارب المعروفة في العالم، التجربة الأولى في الصحراء الجزائرية، والتي ما زالت على البيئة وعلى الأرض، وصلت الإشعاعات النووية إلى قلب إفريقيا، وصلت إلى جنوب فرنسا، وكثير من المتضررين. ولكن في المقابل ربما لحد الساعة لا تجد هناك سياسة واستراتيجية حقيقية ربما للتعامل مع أضرار التجارب النووية، أو مع الأشخاص المتضررين من هذه التجارب. طبعا خلال هذه السنة، وخاصة في سنة 2024، عملت منظمة شعاع ومع شركائها من أجل الدفع أو تسليط الضوء على هذه التجارب النووية التي قامت بها فرنسا في الجزائر سنتين، خلال ربما سنوات الاستقلال، 4 سنوات بعد الاستقلال. يعني هذه التجارب كانت منذ سنة 1960 إلى سنة 1960. وخلال هذه السنة كما قلت، بفضل جهود فريق منظمة شعاع ومع شركائها، تم بهذا الملف وتسليط الضوء على ملف التجارب النووية الفرنسية في الجزائر. وتوصلنا من خلال النصف الثاني من سنة 2024 أنه كانت في رسائل موجهة من مقررين أمميين تابعين لمجلس حقوق الإنسان إلى الحكومة الفرنسية وإلى الحكومة الجزائرية لتحديد المسؤوليات. للأسف الشديد منذ إرسال كانت في شهر سبتمبر 2024 إلى حد الساعة لم يكن هناك أي رد من طرف لا السلطات الفرنسية ولا السلطات الجزائرية. طبعا كنا متوقعين أنه في خضم هذا اللغط الإعلامي وفي خضم توتر العلاقات الجزائرية الفرنسية لعل وعسى أن يكون في تطور في الملف، خاصة من الجانب الجزائري، والذي الآن نرى أنه في حملة إعلامية كبيرة وفيه تعبئة كبيرة، خاصة خلال اليومين الأخيرين، وخاصة اليوم 65 يتبادر هناك إرادة سياسية، أن هناك إرادة من طرف السلطات من أجل التفاعل، الرد على مساءلات الجهات الأممية وغيرها. لكن مع الأسف الشديد لحد الساعة وقبل دقائق عملت ربما إعادة عمل دبل شيك، لكن لم يكن هناك رد لحد هذه الساعة. هناك ربما بعض الاستنتاجات التي ربما أنه نقدر نتقاسمها مع الحضور ومع المتحدثين في هذه الندوة، أنه مع الأسف الشديد يعني بعد مرور 65 سنة من هذه التجارب وبعد سنوات، رغم النداءات المحلية والدولية وخاصة من الجهات من الأشخاص المتضررين وكذلك حتى من المنظمات الدولية وآخرها رسائل المقررين الأمميين بأنه يكون هناك تحرك في الموضوع الاعتراف الرسمي من طرف فرنسا، لأن لديها مسؤولية تاريخية وأخلاقية تجاه الملف، لأنه للأسف الشديد لحد الساعة رغم بتسليم خرائط ومواقع النفايات النووية وأماكن التجارب النووية بالضبط، لكن مع الأسف الشديد ما زالت تتفاعل مع الملف بحجة أو لم يكن هناك رد رسمي بحجة أنه هذا يدخل في إطار الأمن القومي وإطار الوطني لفرنسا. لكن كذلك من جانب الجزائري، رغم حتى تكون من أجل إضفاء الشفافية حول تعامل السلطات الجزائرية مع هذا الملف، ويكون في إرادة سياسية حقيقية لاحتواء أو أقل شيء يبقى المواطنين الأضرار التي ما زالت ناجمة عن هذه التجارب، لكن لا توجد أي ربما استراتيجية لتجنيب المواطنين، بل أكثر من ذلك أنه في وقت من الأوقات أنه زجت بكثير من المواطنين في مواقع التجارب النووية. في ظل هذه ربما المعطيات وفي ظل هذه الحيثيات، ونحن اليوم في الذكرى 65 من أول تجربة نووية فرنسية في الجزائر، ما أشارك استنتاجين حول تعامل السلطات الجزائرية مع الملف. الاستنتاج الأول أنه خاصة من الجانب الجزائري الذي من المفروض أنه ضحية، وأنه يكون هناك فيه مرونة في التعامل مع كل الجهات، محلية أممية دولية، ضحايا، منظمات حقوقية أو منظمات لها مصلحة في هذا الموضوع، لكن لم يكن هناك أي تجانب من طرف السلطات التي واحد والكثير من اللي وصلوا لهذا الاستنتاج أن السلطات الجزائرية بقيت تتعامل مع هذا الملف بشكل وكأنه شكل أو مادة من أجل إنجاز السلطات الفرنسية، أو من أجل ربما استعمالها في وقت الحاجة عندما تكون هناك توتر في العلاقات الفرنسية، دون التزام حقيقي مع مصلحة الشعب أو مصلحة المتضررين أو مصلحة البيئة والعالم بأسره حول أضرار هذه التجارب النووية. لأنه مع الأسف الشديد خلال السنوات الأخيرة، خاصة ربما خلال 20 سنة الأخيرة، كلما كان هناك ربما توتر في العلاقات مع فرنسا ترجع السلطة للحديث عن قانون تجريم الاستعمار والحديث عن التجارب النووية، لكن لا يقابل هذا الخطاب أي إرادة سياسية من أجل المضي قدما نحو ربما حلول لهذا الملف. كذلك وكما لا يخفى على أحد أن تعنت السلطات الفرنسية في عدم تقديمها التعويضات لكثير من المطالبين بتعويضات، وكذلك عدم تقديمها للخرائط ومواقع التفجيرات النووية. هذا بقي هذا الشيء خلى أنه باش يبقى الملف يتراوح نفسه. كذلك ربما استنتاج آخر لعدم ربما تجاوب السلطات الجزائرية مع الآليات الدولية، لأنه يتهم السلطات الجزائرية بأنها هي في الأصل وضعت الكثير من المواطنين سنوات التسعينيات في مواقع التجارب النووية، والذين مع الأسف الشديد أصيبوا بالإشعاعات النووية، وكثير منهم توفي بالسرطان نتيجة الإشعاعات النووية. فقط حتى أفتح قوس أنه حول تعريض المواطنين للإشعاعات النووية، أنه في سنة ما بين سنة 1992 وسنة 1995 العسكر آنذاك عندما وقف المسار الديمقراطي بمسار الانتخابات في سنة 1992 فتح محتشدات عسكرية أمنية، سجون قلب الصحراء. الناشطين أو المتعاونين فائز في الانتخابات المحلية والبرلمانية آنذاك، ووضعهم في أماكن قريبة جدا من المحتشدات، من أماكن التجارب النووية، حيث محتشد أمن فيها أكثر من 20,000 معتقل سياسي آنذاك. ومع الأسف الشديد حتى ربما العسكر الذين كانوا يؤدون الخدمة الوطنية في أماكن التجارب النووية أصيبوا بالسرطان، ناهيك عن إصابة العديد من الذين تم اعتقالهم في المحتشدات الأمنية آنذاك. ولهذا باعتقادي أن هذا الملف كذلك يؤرق السلطات الجزائرية، لأنها في القانون الدولي هي كذلك عرضت المواطنين للخطر، وعرضت حياة المواطنين للموت وللخطر وغيرها، التي تنافي أو التي الدولية التي تدخل خاصة في إطار مناهضة تعذيب وتعريض المواطنين للخطر. هاتين الاستنتاجين أعتقد أنهم هما اللي غالبين، أو الذين ما زالوا يعني كرأي أو ربما كاستنتاجات أولى حول عدم تفاعل السلطات الجزائرية مع هذا الملف، وكذلك السلطات الفرنسية. الكثير خاصة خلال المناصرة التي نقوم بها خلال هذه السنة أو السنتين الأخيرتين هي دعوة الطرفين، السلطات الدولة الفرنسية والدولة الجزائرية، للمصادقة على معاهدة حظر الأسلحة النووية. لأنه الكثير يسأل أنه إذا كان ربما فرنسا لم يكون هناك رد حقيقي أو لم تعطي مواقع التجارب النووية للحكومة الجزائرية، هل يكون في حل أم لا؟ لكن في اعتقادي وفي اعتقاد كثير من المتابعين الملف أنه في هناك حلول بغض الطرف عن ما إذا ردت فرنسا حول المطالب التي ترفعها الحكومة الجزائرية أو المنظمات الحقوقية أم لا. هناك المعاهدة الدولية لحظر الأسلحة النووية تنص خاصة في موادها السادسة والسابعة، تنص أنه كل الأطراف في هذه المعاهدة أنه بإمكانهم أنه خاصة المتضررين من التجارب النووية بإمكانهم الحصول على المساعدة من الدول التي لها خبرة، وكذلك الرعاية الصحية للمتضررين وإعادة تأهيل المناطق التي تمت فيها التجارب النووية. يعني حبيت نقول أنه بإمكان الجزائر يعني عدم حتى ولو أنه لم يكون هناك تجاوب من الطرف الفرنسي، هناك الكثير من الحلول المطروحة للمضي أو ربما إلى حلحلة هذا الملف أو التفاعل أو الأخذ بعين الاعتبار الحالات التي تعرضت لتجارب نووية وتوقيف هذه الإشعاعات النووية. في اعتقادي تقريبا هذه ربما أو المحاور أو الأفكار التي أردت طرحها في هذه الندوة كبداية، وأشاركها مع الحضور والمتحدثين. شكرا لكم مرة ثانية على الحضور كمتحدثين أو مشاركين مستمعين ومتجاوبين، وأعطي الكلمة للزميلة إيمان. شكرا جزيلا.
Shukran, Rashid. Thank you, Rashid, for providing us with this extensive overview of the actual situation of the aftermath of the French nuclear tests and the main challenges faced by the victims and the environment. Next, let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Becky Alexis-Martin. The floor is yours. Dr. Alexis-Martin. Can you hear me, Dr. Becky?
Hi, sorry, I was muted and my video was stopped on the other end, so I wasn't able to talk, which made it a bit difficult. I still can't turn my video on. It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it. So if somebody would like to pop my video on, that would be brilliant, if that's okay. Or I can just talk. I don't mind. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to keep you waiting. So, so I think the Algerian tests in particular are of particular importance and interest. And one of the reasons why is because, so in the global north, in the US, in the UK, we hear an awful lot about the tests in the Pacific, don't we? We hear a lot about Bikini, Bikini Atoll, about the Karissimas tests. And I would argue that the Algerian nuclear weapons tests are comparatively less known, and I think that's really important, because if you don't know about something, then how on earth are you supposed to kind of share the challenges and the issues that are faced? And of course, these tests have had huge impacts. They've affected vast numbers of people. There's been thousands of nuclear test veterans and thousands of local communities impacted by this. So I think it's really important. I think one of the things I want to talk about is the number of people who have actually been affected, and also kind of the type of effects. So in my book, I wrote a little bit about kind of the consequences of the nuclear weapons tests. Estimates suggest that nearly 42,000 Algerians have been affected due to the radiation from the French nuclear weapons tests in Algeria. And that for the French nuclear test veterans, approximately 35% of these veterans have been diagnosed with one or more types of cancer, and 20% are reported to be sterile. So in the context of the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we really need to take action, because there are environmental and humanitarian impacts that continue to affect the region and its inhabitants. So one of the big issues, I think, is the fact that we have some French law in place to support communities and to offer, a small amount of compensation to Algerian affected nationals. However, only about 5% of those affected have actually been able to access this, this aid, due to difficulties with funding, due to difficulties with huge amounts of paperwork. And one could almost argue that the French government has deliberately obfuscated and made this, really challenging for the communities. And when we think about the environmental impacts, we know that there's obviously radioactive contamination, and that there was widespread impacts to vast areas of the Sahara. And that the French authorities, they buried this radioactive waste from the tests in the desert sands. So there's this long-term environmental degradation that needs to be addressed, perhaps through Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. And there's also soil and water pollution as well. So yes, it's a desert environment, but there is still sediment, there is still water, there are still aquifers, and arguably the fallout could have caused, environmental issues. It's suspected that it's disrupted local ecosystems, it's definitely disrupted local agriculture, and it's had long-term impacts on natural resources, which has really affected the livelihoods of these local communities who've lived in the Algerian region for millennia. Which brings me on to the humanitarian impacts. There's been severe health damage due to the exposure from ionizing radiation. And decades later, the lingering effects are still there. There's still alarming rates of cancer, there's still chronic respiratory disease among the local community. And also there's been socio-economic disruption. So the environmental degradation by the tests and the health issues have severely impacted natural resources, they've disrupted livelihoods, and they've negatively affected socio-economic fabric of local communities. It's led to the displacement of population and the loss of the traditional means of subsistence living for the people in the region. So there's many kind of long-reaching consequences to the communities. So I think going forward, as we reflect and memorialise the impact of this pivotal nuclear weapon test, we need... Oh, can you hear me okay? Hello? Yeah, so I think going forward, as we reflect and memorialise the impacts of this pivotal nuclear weapon test, we need to be thinking more about how we can support those who have been affected. And we need to be working really hard to make sure that we do not forget Blue Gerboise, and that we remember the consequences to both French veterans and to the local people. From an environmental perspective, every nuclear weapon test is an environmental catastrophe. I say this as a trained and qualified environmental scientist, and we need to be looking at better remediation. We cannot just write off these vast swathes of Algeria as just desolate wastelands. We need to get in there and start supporting communities moving forward to reclaim their land and to reclaim their rights. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alexis-Martin, for your powerful presentation addressing the humanitarian impacts and addressing the need to support the community, the affected communities. Next, we'll move to hear from Chuck Johnson. Chuck, the floor is yours. Chuck, can you hear me?
Okay, you can hear me now. I had the same problem that Becky had. I can't turn on my video or my audio without your help. So I see her audio, or her video is now working. If you would turn on my audio, you'll be able to see me. But otherwise, I'll just go ahead and make my presentation as she did.
Yes, sir. Can you help with the video?
I can click it again. I've been clicking it, but it doesn't. Here we go. All right, it's working. Yay. Well done. All right. My name is Chuck Johnson. I'm the Policy Director for International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and also the Director of IPPNW's Geneva Liaison Office. I'm honored to be joining this meeting today and proud that IPPNW has endorsed this strong joint statement organized by SHOAA for Human Rights. I want to emphasize the portion of the conclusion of that statement that says, we call on Algeria and France to establish a joint commission to monitor the health and environmental consequences of nuclear tests and other experiments involving representatives from both governments, parliamentarians, and victim associations. We think that this recommendation would be an important step toward addressing past harms to people and the environment, and to informing everyone of the immediate and long-term effects of nuclear weapons detonations and the need to ban these most deadly weapons permanently by mutual agreement, as called for by the Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and by joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Let's see. The need for further study of the effects of nuclear weapons on health and the environment is behind IPPNW's advocacy for a resolution that will be considered by the World Health Assembly in May to study the effects of nuclear weapons and nuclear war on health and health services. The lead member state sponsors of this resolution are the Marshall Islands, Samoa, and Vanuatu, with co-sponsorship from Burkina Faso, Fiji, Guatemala, Iraq, Kazakhstan, Micronesia, and Peru. This proposed WHO study would update not only its 1987 study, Effects of Nuclear War on Health and Health Services, but also the WHO's 1993 study on the health and environmental effects of nuclear weapons. The action by the World Health Assembly would be complementary to the mandate just established in December by the UN General Assembly for the Secretary General to initiate an expert panel to study the effects of nuclear war. In the UN resolution, WHO is specifically named as an agency to be actively involved in the new UN study. This is therefore a policy decision requiring WHO involvement in looking at the health effects of nuclear war. Because the proposed WHO resolution looks beyond nuclear war to more broadly include the health effects of nuclear weapons, this means it would, as a 1993 WHO study did, look at nuclear weapons testing and other aspects of health and environmental contamination associated with nuclear weapons. The report by the Director General to the 46th World Health Assembly, April 1993, on the health and environmental effects of nuclear weapons was a brief study summarizing the health effects of nuclear weapons, the health-related environmental effects of nuclear weapons, and the socioeconomic effects of nuclear weapons. It stated amongst its conclusions, number 53, health and environmental risks associated with accidental releases of radioactivity during nuclear weapons production, decommissioning of nuclear facilities, and dismantling of nuclear warheads, in addition to the health and environmental hazards posed by nuclear tests, are still widespread. These risks will continue as long as nuclear weapons are being produced, and the only remedy is their elimination. Sadly, since that time, the risk of nuclear war is again on the rise, and the health and environmental effects of nuclear weapons, including especially nuclear weapons testing, have not been fully explored, understood, and meaningfully addressed by the nations who created these weapons or by anyone else. We ask our friends who are attending this meeting today to urge their governments to support the EB 156 Conf 10 draft decision, and if possible, to join as co-sponsors in the time leading up to the expected vote during the May 2025 World Health Assembly. I ask you to contact me at the address that I will put in the chat if you wish to have more information or would like to be involved. I'll also put the resolution and the cost estimate from WHO in the chat along with our website. And thank you so much for your time. Again, I'm honored to join you.
Thank you, Chuck, for sharing your expertise with us with the challenges related to health effects and health services in the light of nuclear testing. And you did it in a comparative and analytic approach and your call to action. Please feel free to contact Chuck with if you need any information or if you need to stay in touch with him. Now we have Rachid Aouine. Rachid, over to you. The floor is yours.
Finally. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, sorry, I was muted then. I couldn't get on the call. So yes, my name's Rachid Aouine. I'm the secretary of the Mayors for Peace UK and Ireland chapter. Mayors for Peace was founded in 1982 by the Mayor of Hiroshima, where at a United Nations conference he invited mayors from local authorities across the world to join him in campaigning for a nuclear weapon-free world, and to also campaign to ensure that cities were not targets. So I just wanted to talk today about three things very briefly. One, I wanted to compare the tests in Algeria to the experience of Indigenous people in South Australia who were subjected to British atomic bomb testing. I wanted to touch a little bit on nuclear test veterans because I've done quite a lot of work around supporting their campaign for justice and restitution. And I wanted to touch on the TPNW as Becky has before. So to explain the Australia situation, I had the good fortune to study at Peace Studies at Bradford, and I spent a year in Australia actually studying. And one of the reasons I went specifically to Australia was to look at the impact of British atom bomb tests in South Australia at Maralinga and Emu Field, where from 1953 to 57, the British government exploded 9 atomic weapons. It's interesting when I was reading your information about the Algerian experience that initially the French authorities had looked at Corsica as a site, and interestingly enough, the UK government had also looked at the very north of Scotland and also a town called Skipsea in Yorkshire, also in England, as a possible test site. So moving away from that, they decided to go for nuclear colonialism, and like the French authorities, impose themselves on the Aboriginal people of South Australia. So from there, from 1953 to 57, there were these 9 atomic bomb tests, followed by what were called minor trials. So testing warhead components, which lasted until 1963. The Australian Minister of Defence at the time said that the
Can you turn your camera on, please? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, is that to me?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So basically, the Australian Ministry of Defence said that the test site was uninhabited, but in fact, it had been inhabited for many, many thousands of years by Indigenous people who'd used and transited the land for various activities such as hunting, rituals, ceremonies. What the authorities did as a result of finding that was the case was they actually rounded them up and sent them to Christian mission stations many miles away from the traditional lands. And what they then decided to do was appoint 2 patrol officers to prevent transient Indigenous people from coming onto the test site. Now, it's interesting, they deemed 2 to be adequate, even though the test site represented a quarter of the size of Australia. So a huge area to patrol, and they actually had no vehicle and no radio on appointment to actually carry out the duties they were assigned. In addition, what also happened was the British authorities decided, and the wisdom not, to put signs around the site in English, which of course no Indigenous people could actually understand, and therefore it didn't prove any kind of deterrent to people entering onto the site. Consequently, throughout the test period, there was a great many incursions onto the site, and many people were irradiated. The most famous of which, or infamous and sad certainly, case was the Milpuddy family, who were actually found next to an atomic bomb crater. Sadly, Mrs. Milpuddy was actually pregnant at the time, and she gave birth to a stillborn child. And her family subsequently suffered many cancers, and also had her children subsequently had stillborn children as well. In October 53, the British government exploded the first bomb at Emu Field, which was called Totem 1. That caused a great deal of irradiated dust to rise into the air and fall as fallout in many of the outlying settlements. A lot of them were farms farmed by white farmers, but they employed a lot of Aboriginal workers as stockmen. One of those people was a man called Yami Lester, who you may well know, who was very involved with the work of the anti-nuclear movement, and his daughter's Karina is very involved with ICAN at the moment, and he actually wrote a book about his experience, because I'm sure many of you know that because of his exposure to what was called the black mist, he actually became ultimately blind, and suffered a great deal as a result. But in his book, he actually reports that on the day they were hit by the mist, a great many people were really severely ill, and over 20 of them died within the coming weeks, probably as a result of exposure to radiation. Many of these farms were very isolated. In his case, the farm was over 400 miles away from a clinic. And despite that, no medical help was actually sent to any of the people there who suffered as a result of the blast. And the British authorities attempted to cover up the black mist by saying it was simply a rain cloud, rather than a radioactive cloud. So there was obviously a cover up there. Essentially, as a result of the series of tests that took place in South Australia, the area was very severely contaminated, and very many people suffered. In 1984, Prime Minister Bob Hawke appointed a royal commission, which actually it took 11 years to report. If you've read the report, it's about 550 pages long. But in summary, it was a massive condemnation of the British government and the acquiescence of the Australian government in supporting these atomic bomb tests in South Australia. And in fact, Judge McClelland, who was the man who actually headed up this Royal Commission, actually described the British government's attitude, both military and scientific authorities, towards the rights of Indigenous people and their safety and welfare during and after the testing of the atomic weapons in South Australia as ignorance, incompetence, and cynicism. And they left the site in a tremendous mess. There were half-hearted efforts to clear up the sites where the test took place. But even in 1984, Australian scientists found there were 3 million particles of radiation on one of the sites, and it was described as one of the most dangerous places on Earth. In fact, even the British government conceded they'd only actually collected 900 out of 24,000 grams of plutonium-239 that were actually used as part of the tests. So Australia, the people of South Australia, the Indigenous people, were left with this massive impact of the atomic bomb testing, very much similar to that of the Indigenous people of Algeria. And it is, as I mentioned before, it's an example of this kind of nuclear colonialism that the nuclear powers exhibit towards Indigenous people, always using their land, their resources, willy-nilly, without consideration for the rights that they have, the traditional heritage of stewardship that they have of the land. So that's some of the comparisons between the two. I just wanted to touch on test veterans very quickly as well. Becky's referenced this as well. 22,000 British military personnel participated in tests both in South Australia. There's also one in West Australia. I think there were actually 2 in West Australia, and also obviously in the Pacific. And in fact, the last test that British military veterans participated in was actually one in Nevada in 1992. And actually, the British test veterans are unusual in that they've had no offer of compensation ever from any British government. In fact, the only prospective politician that did make a commitment to pay restitution to veterans for the suffering that they've suffered, which immense suffering, and that of their families, was actually the former leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. Unfortunately, the present Labour Prime Minister in Britain has not chosen to honour that offer of £50,000 per veteran, and the fight for that justice and restitution continues. That's something that I'm very heavily involved in supporting through the Mayors for Peace organisation and through something called nuclear-free local authorities. I just wanted to end with one final comment, really, which is to say, to endorse what Becky's just said. I was going to say the same thing about how we can use Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW to have some leverage against nuclear weapons powers. Obviously, they will not sign it at this time, the treaty. They have no intention of signing it at this time. Some of us who are cynical might think they will never sign it if they can at all avoid it. But certainly what we can do is use the wording of those clauses, those sections of the treaty, to apply pressure on our governments to do the right, the moral, the just thing, which is to recognise the damage that's been caused by testing to veterans, to Indigenous people and to their descendants, and to actually set up a voluntary fund to ensure that we deal with both restitution, health issues, but also environmental remediation in the areas that have been so devastated by the tests. Thank you for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you, Richard. No, thank you for accepting our invitation to participate. Thank you for addressing the effect of nuclear colonialism, especially on the health of the affected communities, Indigenous people, and for lobbying the governments to stick by the provisions of TPNW, especially Articles 6 and 7. Hopefully that will lead us to some results. Now let's hear from Sophie Chalma. Sophie, the floor is yours. You can take over. Sophie, the floor is yours. You can take over.
Yes, perfect. Sorry, it was the same problem. Sorry. I'm also unable to put the video on, so.
Can you try again, like the previous speakers?
Yeah. Yeah, doesn't work for the video. Well, I have a slideshow to actually share, so maybe I can do that instead.
Share this. Yes.
Is it working? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, nice. Perfect. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. I just wanted to thank SHOAA Association for inviting me and interesting me for being part of the webinar. So I'm Sophie Chalma. I'm in the final year of my research master in the social design department at the Design Academy of Eindhoven. So I'm based in the Netherlands. And I started to work on the French nuclear test in Algeria in the context of this critical program, but also after a family conversation that I had a year ago with my grandfather back to France, who actually took part in these French experiments as a military conscript. And back then, I found out how the French nuclear armament had been obtained, something I had actually never heard of, even though I was raised and educated in France. And I found on this moment very questionable the fact that we are taught about the concept of the Cold War and the necessity to possess the nuclear bomb, but never about the colonial context in which it was led, both in Algeria and then in Polynesia. So today I will introduce the design research I'm conducted for this project that will be exhibited for the Dutch Design Week in October this year. And I'm mentioning this because it's a place where international actors in art and design are visiting, but also activists and journalists. So it's also interesting to display the work in this kind of place. So I'm going to start with an introduction to then dive into the three parts that my project is actually articulated around. And yeah, so I'm going to start with like giving a short definition of the social design, which is basically a discipline that focuses on human experience and collaboration to focus on a more inclusive design where the priority is put on the marginalized user groups. So this is the theoretical definition, but the main goal basically is of the social design is to conceptualize transdisciplinary outcomes, to give visibility to a topic, to like also create exhibitions, but also objects or workshop, for example. And the goal is to invite the audience to engage with the topic and to find collective solutions to multi-dimensional issues. So the methodologies that I'm using, I think that was just maybe useful to explain this shortly, because the social design is not really well known. So it's basically the same methodologies that are used in traditional research, so a documentary one and a qualitative one. And I'm mixing these two methodologies with like field trips. I went to Algeria in November. I also went to Lyon to the Observatoire des Armements, which is an archival place. And I conducted several interviews. I'm also analyzing testimonies, academic resources, etc. So the approach that I wanted to focus on for this project is actually developed in a decolonial and post-colonial theoretical framework. And I personally decided to focus on the French compensation system for the nuclear testing victim, which is specifically inefficient in the Algerian context, since only 2 people got a compensation since 2010, so when the law was created. And the main goals of this project are to understand and deconstruct the French colonial narrative around these nuclear tests, but also to analyze the mechanisms behind the inefficiency of the compensation system laid by the clear French absence of political will, in order to actually think about how a more realistic and inclusive system could be designed, and finally to give visibility to the topic to a broader audience. So I'm going to start with the first part, which is the documentary as the design research. So to lead this investigation, I am relying on a non-Westernized archival practice, which is essential in the context of the impossibility to access the data archived by the French state. So on this topic, I really would like to quote the researcher Brahim El Gouabli in the book that have been made by Samia Eni, which is Desert and Not Empty. And he's basically saying that if prevalent notions of the archive emphasize the stability, at least in theory, then desert archives are disarchives. That means they uncover and disrupt that which is supposed to be preserved for eternity in the commonsensical conceptualization of archive. Nothing is stable in the desert. Disarchiving is this continuous movement to uncover and recover that which would have been stabilized if it was kept in a heavily guarded official archive. So the mapping that you can see here is an organizational tool, part of a design methodology that aims to make visible the network of the specialist actors of the topic that I've been in contact with in different fields, and also like to connect their work. And most of these people share their research with me, but also a lot of images and resources, and also a lot of them accepted to be interviewed. So I then started to collect different types of information like images, testimonies, articles, etc., in order to actually understand the facts and how they were deliberately hidden by the French government. But the most important part of my research is the interviews that I conducted with both Algerian and French actors, but also researchers and victims on site in Algeria, but also on the phone, online, etc. And for example, I'm regularly in contact with Mr. Mahmoudi, the National Coordinator for Algerian Victims, which is also like, I mean, he's a person who is really in contact with the victims directly. So to analyze and organize this information, but also to understand what the needs of the victims are in terms of acknowledgement and compensation, the documentary is a very interesting tool because in the case of social design research, this format enables to create a decolonial narrative thread in order to build an argument that precedes the design outcome. And the documentary is also a format that is easily distributed in festivals, for example, but also in exhibitions or online via different platforms, and can then reach a larger audience. So it's a good tool for the visibility and a good format to show what is actually happening there. And it also allows, with this narrative characteristic, to create visual connections, for example, with these 2 images that display the similarities between, on the left, satellite images of the buried nuclear waste, and on the right, an X-ray of the cancer classification. So this parallel makes the link between, let's say, the health of the soil and the population health, boys that are both poisoned by the nuclear test, but also highlights the direct impact of the toxicity of the ground on people's health. So these are some of the elements that will be in this research documentary that aims to analyze and show how the ongoing consequences of the French nuclear explosions are actually, keep going there. And also the urgency to make the law evolve and to decontaminate the soil. For the second part, I'm going to talk about the French compensation system, which is particularly ineffective in the Algerian case. So to start, you can see here 2 extracts of the law text on the left and the personal file to complete on the right. that has been translated in 2023, so 13 years after the creation of the law. And the Algerian victims don't have access to further information from the French government. So there's no explaining graphics or brochure. So it's just the file, and you basically have to understand by yourself. But here you can see that the brochure that has been given for the Polynesian victims is way more developed, which is, of course, necessary to mention that the Polynesian Citizen Association had a strong mobilization on site and have fought to claim for their rights. But it also proves that the French government have the possibility to create such a program, and definitely applies double standards between Algeria and Polynesia. And basically, as a result from the research presented in the documentary, I identified 8 characteristics of the compensation file as elements that narrow down the eligible victims for compensation. And here is the documents that I made, which compares these 8 intertwined points and why they slow down the process of indemnification. So it's a non-exhaustive graph, and it will definitely evolve with the research, and which is also strongly connected to the issue of the contamination of the soil. But so basically we have these 8 points, and first, which is like connected to the deadline for this law. So a very recent deadline just passed regarding the right holders for direct victims that died before 2019, which is the case for most of the people, and then makes the compensation impossible. The second one is the choice of the language for the text, because the law and the file to complete have only been translated from French to Arabic in 2023, while the official language is not French anymore since the independence in 1962. Then the victim also need to prove their presence on the territory at the moment of the test to be acknowledged as victims, but they need to show it with an administrative French documents. And these documents have most of the time not been given by the French army during the test, but if it was actually given, most of them have been destroyed during the Liberation War to not be considered like as collaborationists. So it's really like, I mean, this proof, it's a kind of an absurd requirement. The first element regards the eligible zones for compensation that avoids every village in the vicinity of the test, even though testimonies from both French veterans and Algerian inhabitants report the death of dozens of people in the days following the test. We also have like the list of the illnesses eligible for the French system that reports 23 eligible illnesses, when the Japanese and US system counts 44 and 36. The format of the compensation file is also a very big problem because it's only accessible online, which does not match the reality of some of the Saharan villages that do not always have a strong internet connection. You also have the method of compensation, which is a questioning point, because the French government only wants to focus to give individual financial reparation, which would be fair if more victims were compensated and if the soils were decontaminated. But then the Algerian government is also asking for a collective one that would help medical program and structures to be created. And finally, the current compensation system does not take into account the descendants' pathologies, which are, however, of course, due to the contamination of the soil and the DNA modification of their parents or grandparents. So the second column of this document gathers potential elements to rethink or to respond to this unfair system, relying notably more on the Algerian people's experience and what they could provide to prove they are victims. So, for example, regarding the translation of the documents from French to Arabic, it's also interesting to look at the languages spoken in the Southern Sahara, where the tests were conducted. Because if you look at these maps that have been published by an Algerian Cultural Review, in these regions, the dialects spoken are Berber and more specifically Tamazight, which would therefore be interesting to also propose a version of the text and file in Berber in order to make the victims like the most independent possible without needing another type of translation. This is also on the question of the eligible zones. So you can see that the purple zone is the eligible zone for the compensation. And so this is a map that I made comparing basically this zone in the region of Regan, where the atmospheric tests took place, and the track of the radioactive cloud of the first bomb Gerboise Bleue. And you can see here that the compensation zone avoids every villages, even though the cloud clearly went over them on the D-Day and after. So this data is provided basically by a French map declassified in 2013, showing the trajectory of the radioactive cloud in Gerboise Bleue, that not only spread over the Sahara, but also over North Africa. So here it's kind of pretty easy to prove that the system is not really matching with what has been declassified, basically. Then, and that's the last example of this compensation file, but this is basically the list of the eligible diseases in the French system reduced to 23, when the US system compensating for the Marshall Islands nuclear testing victims count 36. So here again, the French system definitely narrows down the possibility to claim for compensation by voluntarily invisibilizing some of the radio-induced pathologies. And that would therefore need to be rethought in order to maybe align with the American criteria, which seem to be more inclusive on this point. And the outcome, so that's the third part, but the outcome of this reflection will be a physical design file, taking into account these elements based on the independent scientific research on the topic. And the goal of this proposal is basically to think a concrete and fair alternative to the current compensation file in collaboration with Algerian and French independent actors. And factually, this proposal can be considered as a speculative one, since the French government is not yet willing to change the law and the compensation system, but the aim is more to materialize and build this alternative from realistic and scientific data as a sort of an act of resistance, facing the maintenance of the colonial narrative and domination through this inaccessible and unfair system. So the third part of my research, which is going to be the last one, is related to the copper, which is a material that kept coming back in the conversation I had with the people specialized in the topic that I interviewed. And so the copper has basically used by the French army as electric wires for nuclear infrastructures. And it also have been massively abandoned after the test, part of the landfilling policy conducted by the French states, aiming to bury all of the contaminated equipment and material in the sand. So once the tests were done, most of this copper has been recovered by local people who didn't know they were contaminated, in order to first sell it, but also to make daily objects out of it. So a lot of jewels, but also cooking or platters, objects have been made with this traditional Algerian craft, which is the dinanderie, that spread actually the radioactive contamination further. So it's in fact interesting material element that works as a physical vector of narrative, which is in the context of object or exhibition setup, enables to operate a sort of metaphorical recovery of this contaminated material Algerian soil, in order to bring it into a space where it is used to tell the story. So this copper, which was supposed to remain buried in the sand and therefore supposed to remain invisible and silent, is here interesting to make it talk, kind of, in order to reverse the original colonial narrative. So this material, which contaminated the soil by being buried, and the people by being reused and sold, also allows to make this connection between the soil and the population's poisoning. And that's the last element of it, but that's part of my research and the materialization of the project. But the copper here would be basically a narrative and physical material for the transmission of this story in a physical space, incorporated through a setup exhibition like the structure you can see on the right, or a means for like materializing images through copper engraving. I just wanted to end this presentation with two references. One, which is an exhibition that have been made by Samia Eni, which is like, she's a Nigerian researcher, and she made this exhibition specifically on this topic. And she basically gathered all of the archives that were available on the topic to bring awareness on the situation, but also to give the voice to the victims and to the people that were really regarded by the topic. She also made a translation project to give the possibility to non-French speakers to understand the testimonies. And she also made a book, like a critical book about the topic. And this is a second reference that I wanted to show, which is which has been made by forensic architecture, who is a design studio who works in relation with human rights. And they made this platform mapping, which is basically in relation to how the environmental racism is ongoing in the Death Valley in Louisiana. So yeah, just wanted to end with these two references that are very related to the topic. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Sophie, for this innovative approach to using design as a tool to engage and raise awareness about these issues. Thank you for touching on nuclear tests and for working particularly on the French tests, and for the need also to adjust the reparation system to the affected communities and clean the nuclear sites. Thank you again. Thank you to all of our speakers. So I'd like to open the floor to any question or remarks from our speakers and then from our attendees. If you have anything to add or remarks or question, you're welcome to share them with us. Any questions, any addition, any remarks? You're welcome to share them with us. If any of our speakers also would like to add something or add anything, you are welcome to take the floor. Also, we encourage the participants. We have Ahmed Mansri. Go ahead, Ahmed. You can unmute Ahmed and share your question.
مساء الخير الجميع. مرحبا بكل الضيوف، مرحبا بكل الزملاء. أولا أود أن أشكر منظمة شعاع على هذا الزوم الذي يسلط الضوء على جريمة تعد من الجرائم ضد الإنسانية، وبمفهوم القانون الدولي تعتبر إبادة جماعية.
أحمد، هل يمكن أنك الكاميرا؟
شعب أعزل، يعني شعب كان بمثابة ضحية.
أحمد، إذا بالإمكان تفتح الكاميرا تفضل.
ولليوم يعتبر ضحية.
أحمد
تسمع
ولحد الساعة ولحد اليوم هناك يعني
أحمد نجم تفتح الكاميرا
يعني
بتاعك؟
أزمة إنسانية في حق يعني سكان الصحراء الجزائر. كما يعرف الجميع، يعني الجزائريين بالأخص الجزائريين، لاحظنا يعني في نهاية 2022 تم تسليط الضوء على هذا الانتهاكات والإبادة الجماعية التي عمدت فرنسا الاستعمارية آنذاك، وهي عبر تقرير لقناة الشروق عن المشاكل الصحية التي لحد اليوم يعني تحصد أرواح من يعني أرواح يعني من كل شرائح المجتمع
أحمد، هل نجم
الجزائري. هناك ضف على ذلك هناك
أحمد ماكش تسمع.
يعني
أحمد أنت تسمع ولا ماكش تسمع؟ أحمد
حول في هذه المناطق مستعمر، يعني
أحمد
سجون مؤقتة لبعض المعارضين آنذاك مما تسبب لهم في إعاقات وتشوهات خلقية.
أحمد تسمع فينا؟ يمكن الكونكشن عند أحمد the internet connection of Ahmed is not good. I'll move on to Chuck. Chuck.
Are you unmuting?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm here. It sounds like Hamid had a question, but you aren't able to connect him. Is that right? I see Hamid Mehini was asking a question, but I just wanted to, I'll go ahead and jump in here. I was, very struck, of course, and have been all along about this colonialism aspect of nuclear testing and how horrific it is. One of the things that coming to Geneva, the Human Rights Council meets here, and we've engaged with them on for the first time this fall on the issue brought forward by the Marshall Islands with regard to the U.S. nuclear weapons testing that took place in their territory. And I'm wondering if such a because I'm new to Geneva and I haven't engaged with the Human Rights Council previously, I'm wondering if this has been attempted in the case of the Algerian nuclear testing or other aspects of French nuclear testing or other countries that you're aware of. So that's a question. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck, for your question. Rachid, did you hear it in Arabic? If you would like to answer. Or if anyone else.
Let me repeat it briefly as a question. The question is, has Algeria brought the issue of nuclear testing before the Human Rights Council previously? Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck.
اوكي نجاوب ولا نخلي وش اسمه حميد ومن بعد يجاوب؟
جاوبوا بعد نتنقل كل سؤال هكا أفضل باش نبداو.
كما قلت في الأول أنه تفاعل السلطات الجزائرية فيما يخص قضية التجارب النووية تعاملها طبعا المطالب الواضحة من طرف الحكومة الجزائرية هي فقط موجهة إلى فرنسا، لكن في المقابل على مستوى الداخلي أو التعامل مع الآليات الأممية لا توجد هناك أي بوادر أو إرادة سياسية حقيقية من طرف السلطات الجزائرية حتى يكون فيه انفتاح حول الآليات الأممية بما فيها مجلس حقوق الإنسان. والدليل على ذلك أنه حتى من غير السنوات الأخيرة يعني في كثير من الشواهد التي تبين أنه ما فيش شفافية في التعامل مع الملف من طرف السلطات الجزائرية. أكبر دليل في اعتقادي أنه المراسلات الأخيرة اللي بعثها 3 مقررين من مجلس حقوق الإنسان الأممي إلى الحكومتين الفرنسية والجزائرية. طبعا فرنسا هي تحاول أن تتنصل من مسؤوليتها، ربما يعني ما عندها ليس لديها أي عذر، لكن في المقابل الجزائر المفروض أنها ضحية. كنا نتمنى أن يكون فيه تفاعل بشكل سريع مع هذه الرسائل، لكن مع الأسف الشديد لحد الساعة منذ 13 سبتمبر 2024 المقررين الأمميين بمجلس حقوق الإنسان بعثوا رسائل لتحديد المسؤوليات والتساؤل حول مدى عمل السلطات الجزائرية تجاه المصابين بالأشعة النووية أو إعادة تنظيف أو التهيئة أو ما هي استراتيجيتها تجاه الإنسان والحيوان والبيئة، لكن ما فيش أي رد. كذلك تعامل السلطات الجزائرية مع كل الناشطين الذين المعنيين أو الناشطين البيئيين أو الناشطين ينشطوا أو مدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان ينشطوا في هذا المجال يتلقوا تضييق من طرف السلطات الجزائرية، أجهزة أمنية أو سلطات ربما عندها نوعا ما من الرمزية المعنوية اتجاه الشركة التاريخية الاستعمارية، بما فيها بدرجة أولى وزارة المجاهدين. يعني عندما يضيق على الناشطين في هذا المجال يعطي رسالة واحدة، وأنه ليست هناك إرادة سياسية من طرف السلطات الجزائرية في التعامل مع هذا الملف في شقه الحقوقي أو الصحي أو شيء من هذا القبيل. يعني بصفة عامة أنه لا توجد شفافية من طرف السلطات الجزائرية في التعامل مع هذا الملف، وغير منفتحة مع الآليات الأممية خاصة مجلس حقوق الإنسان في استنتاج أنه تحاول أنها تبقي هذا الملف مغلق فقط من أجل استعمال هذا الملف من أجل أجندات سياسية ضيقة دون التزام حقيقي مع مصالح الشعب أو مصالح المتضررين من الشعب أو مصالح الدولة. شكرا.
Thank you, Rachid. I see a question or referral from Jones to the law of ecocide by Polly Higgins. That's for your information. Also, I see a question from Zahi Said. What is your question?
كيف ممكن تعطي الكلمة للدكتور حميد ومن بعد شوفي.
اوكي. أستاذ حميد مهني.
It's not possible to open the yeah, it's okay. I have two questions. The first one is for Richard Ultram. Given your experience with the indigenous population and nuclear tests, you can give us and assess the illnesses on the population of this population. Could we extrapolate this model, if we can say it, to Algerian population? And the second question is for Sophie Chalmin. From the French perspective, why there is 13 illnesses were not included in the list for compensation? Thank you.
Thank you, Said. Richard, would you like to take on the first question?
I didn't quite understand the first question. If the gentleman could just repeat it for me, please.
Yeah, it just comparing if we can, given that the nuclear test, in an area where the indigenous population were affected, the number of the cases, and if we can extrapolate it because to the Algerian case.
Okay, I understand that. I mean, I don't have exact figures of the impacted numbers in the South Australia test, but we could certainly look to find that out and see whether a comparison could be made. And that's something I can maybe take on board and take as an action forward from this webinar.
Okay, thank you.
I might be able to add a little more to this if that's any help, Hamid. So I've been doing research into environmental and humanitarian impacts to Indigenous communities for the past 8 years as an academic in peace science and technology at the University of Bradford. And I think your question poses a really important query, actually, because a lot of the time we have conditions that are medicalized, as you said, there, and we're trying to fit these communities who might even describe their symptoms or experience the conditions differently because of their own ethnic background, their lifestyle, etc., into this very medicalized system, aren't we? Where you have to prove evidence, where you have to evidence a particular condition. And arguably this is unfair upon all communities, not just Indigenous populations. So I worked extensively with the people in Karissimas looking at humanitarian impacts and environmental impacts after the grapple series of nuclear weapons, but also looking at epistemic justice, which is justice of knowledge, and how much the community actually understand the impacts that they've had and how these impacts are communicated. And one of the key issues that has arisen during my research is that a lot of the time the medical profession does not have the awareness of impacts of ionizing radiation to communicate those impacts as medical professionals, as these communities report them. So that's the first issue, is the kind of connection between the medical sector, how the medical sector understand these issues, and how Indigenous communities in particular experience and are able to share, and whether they are listened to when they share these issues. The second issue, of course, is the fact that we argue that we have a good understanding of impacts of ionizing radiation from the Hiroshima study, which is the longest study, obviously, of ionizing radiation impacts. It's almost 80 years old now. But actually, that's a very specific impact of a one-time event. It doesn't take into account the effects of kind of repeated dosage. It doesn't take into account the effects of kind of long-term exposure, and it doesn't take into the accounts of living in a contaminated area and have those kind of impacts in particular. So I would argue, and I should add, my background is as an environmental scientist and public health expert with expertise in radiation physics from my undergrad, and nuclear physics, of course, but like radiation health. So I've kind of got a very interdisciplinary understanding of these issues. And one of the things that really pops out to me is the fact that we just don't give these communities space to describe their experiences. We don't take into account that actually there are many more conditions that we don't recognise that could be related to ionising radiation exposure. And the same issue arises not just with French classification, but also with the US classification and laws in place to compensate and support their own radiation workers, whereby you have this set criteria, and you have a number of conditions that are usually related to things like myelomas, leukemias, basal cell carcinomas, these skin cancers, and soft body cancers, right? But actually the spectrum of conditions is far broader, I would argue, that you have, and this is obviously from my observations during my own fieldwork, which is published. I've got 10 papers, 3 reports, and 1 book if you're interested. But you find that there actually is a far more diverse spectrum of conditions, and arguably, of course, one of the big issues that we don't talk about is kind of the impacts of things like sterility. So 20% of French Algerian veterans are sterile. 20%, the average in the context of the kind of the general population more broadly would be about 5 to 7%. So you've got double or triple the average impacts. You have these cancers as well. You have these other health impacts, but only these cancers and sterility are the documented impacts. And of course, there's a further issue actually that we need to be talking about, and that is not just ionising radiation. So I have spent my career so far kind of arguing that actually we need to think about ionising radiation, but we need to think about the intersection between ionising radiation and other environmental contaminants that arise at these sites. So you have issues with things like beryllium, for example. There is absolutely and definitely beryllium contamination in the Algerian test sites. There's other chemicals, there's volatile organic compounds, there's transition metals, all of these other things that are carcinogens, so they cause cancer, teratogens, they cause birth defects, that both local communities and veterans were exposed to. So we need to broaden our scope. We need to really think beyond the kind of health classifications and beyond the environmental classifications as well, to what I have defined and described in my peer review work as the paranuclear pollution. So this pollution that arises beyond the radioactive and beyond the nuclear as well, because there are a multitude of illnesses and issues and challenges that these communities experience worldwide. So I've worked with the Rocky Flats Downwinders in the US, I've done work in Australia, I've done work in Kiribati, I've worked with the Fijian veterans, and I've also interviewed the French nuclear test veterans as well in my quest to kind of try and understand what's happened. And so, yeah, really good question. We need broader spectrum medical studies and medical engagement. We need our doctors to listen. We need to take into account like polycontaminants, multiple contaminants, and all these other things that arise, as well as ionizing radiation. And we need to look at the impacts of long-term chronic environmental exposure. So many of our studies are focused on one event sites like Hiroshima, or they are focused on nuclear test veterans who have repeated exposures perhaps, but they leave the site. And we need to have a broader and deeper understanding of what happens and how these issues coalesce and kind of come together and entangle in the context of kind of protracted and long-term exposure. So thank you for your question. Sorry to jump in.
Just one question, last question for you, since you give us an very extensive data. Do you know if there is any system for reporting the new cases? As you know, the radioactivity, it will remain for years and years and millions of years.
Yes.
Is there any system for reporting the new cases?
As far as I know, I'm not aware that there are any kind of national systems that formally document. When you say reporting, you mean reporting health issues, right?
I mean, just as my question is just for them to get compensated also, because they are victims.
They are, absolutely. And they have been affected entirely unfairly by the consequences of the nuclear weapons tests.
Exactly.
And the Articles 6 and 7 for the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons aim to provide compensation. Well, I say compensation, they're not using the term compensation, but they aim to provide support for affected communities to ensure that they have what they need in light of the harms that they've experienced. Unfortunately, compensation is often determined on a national basis. So, for example, the UK does not compensate, as Richard very aptly said earlier, British nuclear test veterans. So we're reliant upon the French government, I would imagine, given Algeria's colonial legacy, in order to kind of begin to support these communities to kind of gain the reparations and the medical support even that they deserve. As we know, Algeria, it needs better, medical capacity, better diagnostic capacity. It needs a lot more. So it's difficult. There are projects out there that look at ways to report that are sympathetic and aim to support Indigenous communities. So there's an amazing project by Dimity Hawkins, who helped found ICANN, called the Nuclear Truth Project. And I think that they've got work underway to try and document and report issues. And then there's academics like myself. There's several different researchers doing work like me, from Ivana Hughes at Columbia to Matt Bolton-Bray over at Pace University. But the problem is, of course, that there is nothing centralised at the moment. So this is a really good point. Thank you so much, Hamid. Did that help?
Thank you very much for your...
My pleasure.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Hamid, for your question, and thank you, Becky, for the rich explanation. Sophie, would you like to take Hamid's next question?
Yes, I think it was related to the 23 illnesses, right?
Yes.
13, the discrepancy between the American and Japanese lists of the illnesses and the French list of illnesses.
Well, to be honest, on a scientific level, I think, well, I don't really have the answer, especially because I tried to reach out to the scientific committee, to the scientific and the doctor team who actually took this decision to reduce it to 23 or to only select 23. And they never replied. So I can't really say why this selection have been made. But what I think, and I've been discussing it with experts from this very specific situation, that it's probably one of the several avoidance strategies that has been made, like that has been created by the French government to, and that's what also like Rachid was saying, and also Becky, to just get rid of the responsibility to face the nuclear test. I think this is the same list for the Polynesian victims, and the system seems to work better. But I think because also they have more documents to provide, so it's maybe easier for them. And there's a whole follow-up program that has been made. But for the Algerian case, I think this is definitely part of the avoidance strategy. And in the, for example, in the US case, all of the types of the cancer are actually eligible for compensation. And in the French case, you only have like a very, very specific selection. So you also can't have like compensation, for example, if you have a cataract or something like this, which is very, very common in the case of nuclear explosions. So yeah, it's definitely part of this, and I don't really have the reply directly from them, but it's something that I kind of deduced from the situation, especially because the French system is the only one that actually made this very specific selection. So yeah, that's the only thing I can actually say. Yeah, you're mute. I think you're mute.
Thank you, Sophie. Dr. Becky, would you like to add something?
I think it's been really well answered actually already, so I'm not sure I have anything else to add beyond what I've already said. But thank you for giving me that space and opportunity.
Yeah,
So,
just for Sophie, the removing 13 illnesses. This means for the desert population of the area where the nuclear tests were conducted, it means they don't have a chance to ask for compensation, not for themselves as for covering at least the cost of the illness for medical point of view.
Yeah, that's the thing, and that's the thing with the whole compensation system, because
it's
every
called
point.
Loi Laurent,
Loi Morin.
Yeah,
exactly.
Deal. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the whole thing, because I mean, yeah, the illnesses are some of the many aspects of the law that has been, deliberately made to actually not compensate anyone. Because also, if you look at the number of files that have been actually given to the committee, it's like, I think last year was maybe something like 1,000 from the Algerian victims, and only 2 have been compensated for like the 15 years that the law is actually existing, So it's really a few. And the criteria is super selected. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm gonna move to Mohammed Mrabet Ayesh. I see his hand is raised. Mohammed Mrabet.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me this chance. I've got a question concerning the Algerian nuclear test, the French nuclear test in Algeria. It happened between the 1962 and 1966. My question here was Algeria got independence in 1962, and France passed this nuclear test in 1966. Anyone has got information? Is that nuclear test is a part of Evian negotiations, or is that is France conducted that nuclear test by giving promises to the Algerian regime, and the Algerian regime opened the door for the France to test that in Algeria? I'm talking about the time between 1962 and 1966. So that 4 years, we conducted over 12 testing nuclear bombs. And also, this is my first question. And the second question is, if that was a part of the Evian negotiations, how can the compensation affected the victims in Regan and Eka and Sahara Desert? Yeah, that my two questions. And thank you very much for giving me this chance.
Thank you, Mohammed. Does one of our speakers would like to answer this question?
I think I can maybe reply for the first one. The second one, I'm not sure that I really understood it, but for the context of the nuclear test, yeah, so I think basically 6 were conducted between 1960 and 1962. And then when the independence occurred, was declared with the Evian agreements, something was actually literally written in the Evian agreements that mentioned the fact that against the independence, then Algeria would accept that the French government would continue to conduct the nuclear test. So it's a sort of agreement, but in the same time, they didn't really have the choice because the independence was only declared if they accepted this. So it was only either the war or the continuation of the nuclear test. And I'm not sure that I really understood the second one. So yeah.
Yeah, if you allow me, I can reply for the Evian agreement. In the Evian agreement, when you read it, there is no mention at all to any nuclear tests, which means when you know the history of France, you know always that they make agreements with known in the bill, known all the things, but they keep also a secret hidden, if you want, some of the agreements. Therefore, it's not easy to understand why they left them. According to some politologues, which they explain that they were made under the table, not on the agreement. In the agreement, in the bill or the agreement of Evian, they tell there will be a close collaboration for the economy, for all for many things, but except they don't tell it directly, which is harming the desert for a long time, for millions of years, without any cleaning, removing this garbage, treating all the population that were affected. There is it looks like, through my understanding, it looks like, except if the government of Algeria has documents, but as you know, there is no declassification of the documents made public for anyone who want to have a look at this topic, and therefore, apparently, even until now, they did not allow to anyone to get a look at it. Thank you.
Are there any more questions, or if anyone would like to add something, a remark? So I don't see any hand raised.
Sorry, just concerning the second question, I would like to repeat it. How, if that is a part of the IVN negotiations, how in terms of compensation, does compensation affect on the victims, so that victims are not gonna get compensations because that was on the Evian negotiations? That means here the responsibility of the negotiators, or there is a chance where we can the victims take the France into bring France into a human rights justice or international court of justice. So how can that victims can get the compensation?
There is no mention at all in the Evian agreement on the nuclear tests. There is no at all. You will not find it. I invite you to go and to read it. You will not find any mention or even hints to the nuclear tests. I read it very, very well and looked, but unfortunately, there is no data available or anything that talks about, which is maybe either the Algerian government has the data, or the French definitely they have it, but they don't make it public. You don't have access. Therefore, it's not easy to reply to this question. Regarding the compensation, I think there is a way to get the compensation, maybe to go to the International Court of Justice, because it's a matter as a civilized people, they should go to this court and to settle the problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I see Jones has asked another question. Dr. Chris Busby is conducting research in the DPUs, depleted uranium weapons in war zone. I think it's a question. I'm going to repeat it. Dr. Chris Busby is conducting research into DPUs, depleted uranium weapons in war zone.
And this is a question, or just a comment asking us to comment on it?
Yes, it's more because he has
because it's related to what I passed on from the question that I had in the chat. Yeah, right. I have not looked at these depleted uranium studies myself and evaluated them. I know that it's been difficult to get them published in medical journals, and so for a variety of reasons. But it's something that I'm personally interested in. I'm going to be interested in knowing whether or not Iraq, is interested in that in terms of this WHO study. It wouldn't necessarily be covered by the definitions that are in the old studies that they're supposed to be updating. So they might have trouble getting that added in. But I do think it's a very valid question because it's being used all the time in weapons in war zones. And there's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence that people have had health effects from it at the very least. So I personally am interested in it and hope to know more about it very soon.
Thank you, Chuck. I see Jones. Would you like to unmute?
Hello? Hello?
We can hear you.
Yes, I just threw that in because I follow Dr. Chris Busby's work, and I know he's been doing research on DPUs in the Middle East, and I think they've been used in Ukraine as well. So the third nuclear world war has started already, actually.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Jones. Would any of the guest speakers want to add anything? Since we have the floor open. If not, Zahi Said has asked a question before. I don't believe it was answered. Mr. Said, would you like to ask your question again? Zahi Said, would you like to ask your question again?
تسمعوني سيدتي؟
Yes, yes. نعم.
مساء الخير والشكر للجميع على هذه المبادرة، خاصة هذه الانفجارات النووية وهذه التجارب النووية التي تمت بين سنتي 1960 1966 أحدثت أضرار كبيرة لسكان منطقة رقان وما جاورها. وأيضا المشكلة أن هذه الآثار ما زالت مستمرة، وهي جريمة في حق الإنسان والحيوان والبيئة. الإشكالية الكبيرة أن هذه الجريمة ما زالت مستمرة إلى هذه اللحظة التي تقام في هذه الندوة. سؤالي سيكون عمليا، بالرغم من أنه استفادتي كانت قليلة لنقص ترجمة، يعني الفكرة العامة أفهمها، لكن في التطبيق لم تسمح لي الترجمة من فهم كل ما طرح. لكن سؤالي عملي، بما أن هذه الانفجارات أو هذه التجارب قلت كان لها تأثير كبير على الإنسان والبيئة والحيوان وما زالت، هل أو ما هي الآليات المستعجلة بصفة استعجالية بما أن الأضرار ما زالت متواصلة، ما هي الآليات الناجعة المستعجلة لإلزام الدولة التي تسببت في هذه الأضرار لمعالجة أو إيقاف هذه الأضرار؟ ثاني سؤال، وهو كيفية التقليل من هذه الأرضيات، أو أيضا كيفية إلزام هذه الدولة بالتقليل من الآثار، خاصة أنه إلى حد الآن لا توجد تفاصيل كثيرة كيف تمت هذه التجارب، وبالخرائط المكانية أين تمت وآثارها الحقيقية على البيئة والإنسان والحيوان. قبل، لأنه سمعت في حميد إن فهمت ما التركيز على التعويض يكون في مرحلة ثالثة بعد إيقاف هذه الأضرار والتقليل منها وتبيانها وطريقة حدوثها، وطبعا التعويض بعد كل ما العدالة تأخذ مجراها. التعويض يكون في مرحلة أخيرة، وهو ضروري جدا لتعويض كل المتضررين من هذه النتائج. هذا سؤالي الأول. شكرا.
شكرا أستاذ سعيد للسؤال متاعك. Did our panelists get to listen to this question in English?
ممكن نعطي أنا نصف إجابة، وربما الزملاء يزيدوا بعض من الإجابة. في اعتقادي
Okay.
أنه هو الوضع فيما يخص توقيف الأضرار واهتمام بضحايا التجارب النووية أو المتضررين بالتجارب النووية، ووقف هذا الضرر المستمر اللي ما بقاتش فقط ربما أنه قال أنه شيء أو كارثة وقعت في وقت ما وانقطعت من ذلك التاريخ، وإنما بقيت مستمرة بعد 65 عام. في اعتقادي أنه هذا العمل يستوجب كثير من العمل المشترك والتعاون كسلطات محلية وإرادة سياسية من طرف الحكومة الجزائرية والنظام الجزائري، وكذلك المختصين والمهتمين والمجتمع المدني والمجتمع الدولي. وهذا بعتقد أنه ما يكونش هذا التكامل لو لم يكن هناك في انفتاح حقيقي على مستوى الأرض أو فتح الباب للناس المتضررين حتى باش يوصلوا صوتهم أو باش يتكلموا على معاناتهم. هذا الشيء في اعتقادي أنه يسقط على الوضع العام الحقوقي في الجزائر، لأنه مع الأسف الشديد أنه حتى هذا الملف اللي كان من المنتظر أنه بغض النظر على ربما اختلافات سياسية ما بين الجزائريين أو معارضين أو مساندين، لكن أعتقد الجميع أنه يتفق أنه هذا فيه مسؤولية تاريخية وأخلاقية وتجاه فرنسا، وكذلك فيه مسؤولية كبيرة من طرف السلطات الجزائرية في التعامل مع هذا الملف. والجميع يتفق أن هناك كارثة كانت وقعت بداية من الاستعمار و4 سنوات بعد الاستعمار. هذا شيء كامل يتفق فيه كامل الجزائريين وحتى الناس اللي خارج الجزائر وأصحاب المصلحة بشكل عام. لكن مع الأسف أنه النقطة التي ربما أنه هي تكون بداية انطلاق ربما لبداية حل هي غير موجودة، وهي اللي للأسف شديد هناك يعني في انسداد في هذا الأمر، بحكم أنه السلطات الجزائرية هي غالقة الفضاء العام، غالقة حتى على الضحايا. احنا كمنظمة شعاع حاولنا العديد من المرات التواصل مع الضحايا من أجل رفع قضاياهم إلى الجهات الأممية، أو ربما الحديث أو أقل شيء أنهم يسردوا معاناتهم في تسجيلات أو في شهادات مكتوبة أو موثقة بالصورة والصوت. لكن مع الأسف الشديد نرى أن هناك تخوف من المواطنين أو المتضررين، متخوفين من السلطات الجزائرية اللي من المفروض أن هي تفتح لهم الباب باش ينفتحوا ويكون الناس كامل صوت واحد من أجل أقل شيء أن وقف هذا الإشكال وهذا الضرر المستمر. في اعتقادي أن المشكل أو المسؤولية الكبيرة أو الشيء المهم هو أنه كيف السلطة أو السلطات المختصة والسلطات المحلية والوطنية والحكومة والنظام بشكل عام، أنه هو المفروض أنه تكون في إرادة سياسية للانفتاح حول لملمة هذا الموضوع وتوقيف الأضرار وإعادة هيكلة المناطق التي تمت فيها التجارب النووية. يعني هذا جزء من الإجابة. أعتقد أنه في زملاء إذا في إضافة.
ممكن أن نزيد إضافة؟
نعم.
الأستاذ الزاهي اللي نحييه على كل حال في هذه مسألة تاع التعويضات. التعويضات لازم تكون حتى في البداية. أنتم تعرفوا أنه النظام الصحي في الجزائر خصوصا في عندما تعود القضية في السرطانات هذا مشكل، لأنه هناك أدوية مكلفة. نعطيكم مثلا أنه سيونس تاع شيميوثيرابي، عندما تستعمل لا شيميوثيرابي تدير ما بين 6000 إلى أكثر من 15000 يورو. الجزائري اللي من الصحراء من هذوك المناطق اللي مضروع ماهوش قادر يتكفل بها. وزيد انه الدوله ما تكفلش بها، لانه عندما تشوف لا ليست تاع الادويه تاع اللي يتعاملوا بها في معالجه السرطانات هذا مشكل. اذا لا كومبونساسيون يعني تعويضات لازم تكون في البدايه. يعني عندما تكون احنا ما ناش نهضروا على يعني المضره لانه كمريض وما يقدرش يشتغل، حتى لصحته الانسان هذاك باش يتمتع بصحه جيده. اما قضيه وقف يعني تنظيف المناطق اللي عملوا فيها التجارب النوويه، هذه تطيح على عاتق النظام الحكومة. والحكومة حاليا هي ما تديرش اللي لازم. انتم ما شفتوا في اليابان عندما وقع انفجار تاع المفاعل النووي، اليابانيين مشاو ونظفوا هذوك المناطق باش حتى ما تنضرش السكان هذوك، ما ينضروش، وعدة أمور يعني اتخذت. لماذا لا النظام الجزائري ما يعملش نفس الشيء في هذه المناطق وتركهم أكثر من 60؟ في هناك ناس اللي تقول أنه التجارب وصلوا حتى 1978 ما يجيش حتى ل 66. إذن حان الوقت لهذا النظام، الحكومة هذه تأخذ مسؤوليتها وتشوف يعني كيفاش تنظف هذه المناطق، لأنها راح تستمر لملايين السنين. هذا مش راح يتوقف لملايين السنين، هي راح تستمر. إذن هناك حكم والإدارة اللي لازم تأخذ مسؤوليتها. ماهوش ممكن يعني تنصل وعندما يكون عندها مشاكل مع الدولة الفرنسية تخرج هذا الملف، وعندما ما يكونوش المشاكل يعني الملف يرجع إلى يعني كما يقولوا بالعامية الخزانة. هذا ماهوش مقبول هو، لكن مع الأسف هذا هو اللي حاليا يعني نشوفه فيه. وشكرا.
شكرا حميد، شكرا.
هل 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 يمكنني إضافة
يعني تفسير
باختصار خاطر الوقت قريب يوفى.
طبعا سي حميد، التعويض شيء ضروري ولا بد منه، لأنه أي إنسان يتضرر من جريمة لازم تعويض. ولكن أنا سؤالي أركز، لأنه كما قلت هناك استغلال سياسي لهذه الانفجارات في كل مرة الحديث عنها مهرجانيا أو للذكرى، وإنما أنا سؤالي عملي محض، وهو أولا قبل التعويض يجب أن تكون هناك الإدانة أو على الأقل الاعتراف من الدولة الفرنسية. هل نترك المجال إلا للإدارة الجزائرية والدولة الجزائرية لترفع هذه المطالبة أو التعويض، أو يمكن للأشخاص المتضررين من هذه التجارب إلى اللجوء إلى حتى المحاكم الدولية من أجل إجبار الدولة المتسببة في هذه الأضرار على ما ذكرت سابقا من تطهير، من تبيان ومن تعويض هؤلاء الناس، أو على الأقل إلزامهم بالتكفل بهم في مستشفياتهم للعلاج. هذا سؤالي للتوضيح.
ممكن إضافة وإجابة يعني باختصار. شوف أستاذ زاهي، فرنسا خرجت قانون يقولوا له قانون مورا، لا لوا مورا. هذاك القانون هو يعطي لك، يعني عندما تحط الملف يعطي لك تعويضات، يعطيك تعويضات. يعني بصفة غير مباشرة هناك اعتراف، بصح ماهوش اعتراف رسمي ما بين دولة إلى دولة أخرى أو لا. هذه هي الإجابة. هما ميعوا القضية هذه في قانون لا لوا مورا، ميعوها.
أنا حبيت ناحية الميع هذا وندخلوا في الصح.
لازم تكون عندك دولة اللي عندها حكومة ولا نظام ولا اللي عنده شرعية.
شكرا أستاذ حميد، شكرا زاهي سعيد. نعطي الكلمة الختامية لرشيد عوين.
ربما سفيان عنده سؤال، أو الدكتورة نورة كذلك عندها سؤال ما شفتوش. تفضل سفيان باختصار حتى باش نعم. تفضل سفيان. سفيان أعتقد خرج سفيان. دكتورة نورة تفضلي.
الو سمعني؟
نعم تفضل.
نسمع فيك.
Merci. Juste sur les clauses, les accords d'Évian, juste pour ajouter que en 1997, le nouvel observateur a révélé un rapport que jusqu'en 1978, 16 ans après l'indépendance, les essais ont continué sur une base secrète dans le Sahara au nom de B2 Nemous, au nord du Sahara algérien, où un gigantesque polygone de plusieurs milliers de kilomètres carrés dans le nord du Sahara. Les militaires français sont restés après 1962 sous l'uniforme puis sous couverture civile, avec l'autorisation des plus hauts responsables algériens. Ce secret d'État avait été révélé en octobre 1997 dans le magazine du Nouvel Observateur. C'était le plus vaste centre d'expérimentation d'armes chimiques au monde. Donc, je ne sais pas, là vous avez entendu parler de cela. Et cet accord du cadre sur B2 Namous est signé en catimini par l'ambassadeur français Pierre Deleuze et le commandant algérien Chabou. Et apparemment, ça a été au nom du président Ouad Boumediene.
Merci Sofiane. Merci à vous. Je vais prendre la question de Nora. Nora, après on va نورا.
يعطيك
Merci, c'est bon, parce que je ne pouvais pas actionner le son. On voit que beaucoup de zones d'ombre restent encore sur ce dossier, malgré qu'il est très ancien. Je rejoins un peu Maître Zahi de par le blocage des autorités algériennes, un collectif d'Algériens au niveau de la diaspora peut faire quelque chose sur le plan justice et tout, justice internationale. Et ma question, c'est quel autre levier peut-on actionner pour faire justement bouger ce dossier et comment? S'il y a des leviers qui n'ont pas été actionnés jusqu'à présent, lesquels et comment on peut faire vraiment pour faire bouger ce dossier parce que quand même on est en 2025. Merci.
Merci, Nora. Rachid, do you want to answer one of the questions? I see you were taking notes, or would any
تفضل حميد.
نقدر نجاوب؟
ايه تفضل.
أني يا نورا كما كنت نتكلم مع أستاذ زاهي لا لوا مورا فرنسا باش ما مش غير الجزائريين اللي متضررين من التجارب النووية. Pardon, je vais peut-être parler en français, c'est mieux pour elle. Le problème des tests nucléaires français, ce n'est pas que l'Algérie qui est touchée, il y a aussi la Polynésie. Donc, les deux, pour essayer, soi-disant, pour traiter le même problème, que ce soit en Polynésie ou en Algérie, le gouvernement français, il a sorti ce qu'on appelle la loi Morin pour indemniser. Seulement, cette loi, elle doit compenser, dédommager les personnes. Et le problème, c'est la liste des maladies qui peuvent être liées aux radiations ionisantes. Et cette liste, il y a une différence par rapport à la liste faite par les Japonais et les Américains, qui comprend 36, et la liste française qui en a 13 de moins. Donc, du coup, le grand problème, c'est que les Français, ils ont anticipé en disant, voilà, il y a une loi déjà qui existe, etc., pour pouvoir compenser les personnes qui ont été lésées. Maintenant, du point de vue entre États, par exemple, pour pouvoir s'adresser à la Cour internationale de justice, puisque elle fait allusion, Nora a fait allusion probablement à ça, ce n'est pas aussi facile. Pourquoi? Parce que quand il y a des mécanismes par lesquels on peut traiter ces problèmes, ils existent. Du coup, vous ne pouvez pas, parce qu'ils vont vous dire, allez-y. Mais le problème, c'est le problème du nettoyage de tous ces sites. Il y a, moi j'invite les personnes qui sont intéressées par la question de lire, il y a un livre d'Imène Hmili, qui est un politologue. Tout à l'heure, j'ai fait référence en anglais à ce politologue, où il a écrit que des accords secrets ont été signés entre la France et Boumediene, dont même Bouteflika, qui était son ministre des Affaires étrangères, n'était même pas au courant. Même pas au courant, tellement c'était gardé très secrètement. Maintenant, si le gouvernement algérien veut réellement régler ce problème, il existe des moyens, mais qu'ils sortent et qu'ils le disent. Mais comme vous le savez, ils n'en parlent pas. Ils sortent l'histoire des essais nucléaires que quand il y a l'anniversaire. Pendant toute l'année, ils oublient. Ils oublient de régler ce problème. Il est temps pour l'environnement, parce que non seulement c'est l'Algérie qui est touchée, mais il y a aussi parce que les vents de sable vont jusqu'en Europe. Jusqu'en Europe. Et donc la radioactivité peut arriver, peut toucher le sud de la France, l'Italie et l'Espagne. Il est temps que le gouvernement algérien prenne ses responsabilités et s'adresse directement et trouver des mécanismes. Maintenant, si
باختصار أستاذ حميد خاطر الوقت متاعنا سيء وفاء.
Ok. Je pense que j'ai donné parce que c'est beaucoup plus complexe. J'ai essayé de voir, c'est beaucoup plus complexe, mais s'il y a une volonté politique derrière, je pense que le problème il sera réglé. S'il n'y a pas de volonté politique, vous ne pouvez rien régler. Voilà ce que j'avais à dire.
Merci Hamid. I give the word to Rachid for closing remarks.
فقط أنا في الأخير أود الحديث أن أقول أنه هذا العمل يحتاج ربما جهد الجميع، وفي طبعا الموضوع مش معقول أنه باش أو الملف أو القضية تبقى فقط مربوطة إذا قدمت فرنسا الخرائط أو مواقع التجارب النووية أو اعتذرت أو أعطت ربما بعض التعويضات لبعض المتضررين، وإنما العمل يجب أنه يكون الدفع نحو دفع الدرجة الأولى هو ربما دفع السلطات الجزائرية إلى انفتاحها وعملها بجدية مع هذا الملف، لأنه هذا ما هوش فقط الملف، ليس فقط ربما له ربما دلالات تاريخية أو ربما مكاسب معنوية، وإنما للأسف الشديد أنه المشكل والضرر مازال مستمر إلى اليوم. تشوهات خلقية، أمراض وغيرها من ربما الآثار هذه الإشعاعات النووية. اليوم احنا في هذه المناسبة كان في صدرنا 30 منظمة، أغلبها كلها منظمات دولية، طالبوا فيه السلطات الجزائرية والفرنسية لتحمل المسؤولية ونداء عالمي للعدالة والإنصاف، وكذلك لتحمل المسؤولية لكل الجهات المعنية بهذا الموضوع. كما أنه من خلال هذا اللقاء نريد نرسل كذلك رسالة إلى السلطات الجزائرية بأن هذا الموضوع ليس فقط حكرا على السلطات الجزائرية، وإنما هو ملف يهم كل الجزائريين، وفي نفس الوقت أنه نتمنى هذا الملف أنه دائما يكون الحديث عنه نابع من إرادة سياسية من أجل تسوية هذا الملف أو توقيف هذه الأضرار المستمرة للإشعاعات النووية، ولا يكون الحديث عن هذا الملف وعن التجارب النووية فقط موسمية عندما يكون في هناك توتر في العلاقات ما بين الجزائر وفرنسا. وشاهدنا كذلك خلال السنوات الأخيرة بما فيها قانون تجهيم الاستعمار أنه تم توقيفه مثلا من طرف الجهات المحسوبة على السلطة في سنة 2020، سنة 2005 و2006 عندما كان سعداني وأحمد ويحيى، 2020 في وقت تبون كذلك في 2020 و2021 اللي أنه رئيس البرلمان آنذاك ورئيس جبهة الأمين العام لجبهة التحرير الوطني هم اللي كانوا وراء توقيف قانون تجهيم الاستعمار. وهذا يعطي دلالات واضحة بأنه ما كانش إرادة سياسية حقيقية من طرف السلطات حتى باش يكون حل لهذه المعضلة وهذا الملف الشائك، وإنما فقط ما زالت السلطات الجزائرية مع الأسف الشديد أنه تستغله فقط من أجل مصلحتها الضيقة. شكرا جزيلا. أنا بودي نشارك أن نشكر المتحدثين معنا ونعتذر على الإطالة، وكذلك الحضور اللي تفاعلوا معنا، وإن شاء الله تكون إن شاء الله أنه يكون في المستقبل أنه نشاطات أكثر وتكثيف لجهد أكثر حتى باش نسلطوا الضوء أكثر على هذه المعاناة التي يعيشها المتضررين من هذه التجارب النووية، وكذلك يكون هناك فيه تضخيم لصوت العدالة وصوت الحق وصوت ربما حتى من أجل أنه باش نكون صوت المتضررين من هذه التجارب النووية وصوت الناس اللي تعرضوا لهذه الإشعاعات النووية. شكرا.
Thank you, Rachid. I want to thank all participants today for being part of this crucial conversation. I want to extend my gratitude for all of our speakers today. Their insights and expertise have been invaluable in shedding light on the legacy of these French nuclear tests in Algeria. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today, and I wish you all a peaceful day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Bye. you.